risk assessment. And risk assessment is basically we evaluate or how we figure out the risk associated with something besides doing that thing before we do that thing or we take some action for that thing. So, example, you could have a risk assessment for driving your car, right? And there is going to be a different risk assessment or hazard or risk associated with driving your car normally and driving your car with without a seatbelt, right? It's going to be more dangerous to drive your car without a seatbelt. Um, there could be like my parents, they my both my kids are still rear facing. My 2-year-old, his legs are getting kind of all cramped rear facing, and my parents said, I think he's running out of room. I think he's kind of you should turn him around because I think his legs are squished. I said, well, one, his legs aren't really that squished, but two, um, the risk of internal decapitation, basically your kid getting decapitated, but only internally, so they look like their head is still attached, but it's not really on the inside, um, is much, much, much higher when they're forward facing until they get to a certain height and weight. And so even if their legs are squished, I'd rather them have broken legs than becoming internally decapitated, right? And then when I explain it like that to my parents, they're like, oh, yeah, well, yeah, that does sound worse. The same with airbags, right? When you're using an airbag, if you have your hands in the correct position when you're driving, the airbag, when it comes out, it can actually burn your hands. But the burns on your hands are not nearly as bad as what would happen to you if there wasn't an airbag, if the airbag didn't come out. And so, there's a risk assessment about that. And so, you can kind of weigh the risks. I like to think I think it's always funny to look at this where they say peanut butter. Basically, if you eat too much peanut butter, you can get like cancer, or whatever, and it'll reduce your life expectancy. But you see, peanut butter is on the list, but it's way down there, right? Um, you're more likely to die from a bicycle than you are peanut butter. But it's interesting. Some of the things that we think are high risk, right? Like having AIDS. Being an alcoholic is actually going to reduce your life expectancy more than AIDS, which is kind of interesting. Um, there's smoking, and smoking as a male apparently reduces your life expectancy more than smoking as a female, which is kind of interesting. My kids always felt bad about this. Poor social connections, right? If you don't have a lot of friends or whatever. Um, so it's kind of interesting how you can see the different like drinking water. Drinking water is usually pretty important. I'm drinking water right now. But if you drink too much water or whatever, it can reduce your life expectancy. So it's kind of interesting to just kind of see these kind of things and look at your risk. So how do we manage risk? There's a few things we do. We basically look at all the information pertaining to that hazard, and then the risk characterization, and then we see if the weight of evidence basically justifies regulatory action. So, for example, seatbelts, right? They've looked at how dangerous it is to drive without a seatbelt and how dangerous it is to drive with a seatbelt, and so now seatbelts are the law, right? Same with the car seats, right? It didn't used to matter. You could switch your kid from rear facing at a year. You could switch them, I think, even a long time ago, even before that. But then they found that it's much less dangerous for kids in a car accident if they're rear facing. So now the law is 2 years in most places. You can't put your kid forward facing until they're at least 2 in a lot of places. And then you can even keep them rear facing even longer than that if you want to. So basically they've decided that the regulatory action is necessary for those kinds of things. And then all these regulatory decisions tend to hinge on a few of these things. And what's interesting is there's that cost benefit analysis, which you would think that would happen in a risk benefit analysis, but also public preference. And so what the public thinks is also very important for these sorts of things. And so a lot of times the perceived risk is a lot higher than the actual risk, and so they tend to regulate things like that. I used to have a graph, I don't know if I have it anymore, that would show like basically perceived risk versus actual risk, and it was very interesting to see. Here it is. So you can see here that, for example, a plane crash, right? The public outrage over plane crashes is very, very high, but the actual hazard is very small, right? For example, let's see, a car accident, right? The public outrage over car accidents is small, right? We all ride in the car to get places, but the actual risk is much, much higher than an airplane. You can see those are kind of backwards, which is interesting. The risk of cancer is very high, but the public outrage is not so much. And this might be because so many people have cancer that we don't even really think about it, you know. Heat, you know, you don't really think about heat being like super dangerous, but you know, there's the outrage over heat is not as large as the outrage um as the actual hazard of, you know, getting hurt from heat. And then the terrorist attack, of course, is opposite. There's the actual risk of a terrorist attack you see is very, very small, but the outrage is very large. And so it's interesting. This kind of stuff has caused regulation. If the public outrage is very large, um, there tends to be more regulation on that sort of thing, um, which I think is interesting. So this is a precautionary principle. I know we've talked about it before, but basically, there's a lot of times this risk assessment won't adequately reflect the uncertainty in much of this process. We don't really know exactly how certain chemicals are going to affect us or how, you know. And so basically the burden of proof often falls on the regulators, the people trying to make the regulations, instead of the people making the chemicals, right? The people making the chemicals are saying, well, prove that this chemical is not safe. And the people that are regulating are saying, prove that it's not. And unfortunately, the regulators are having to prove that it's unsafe rather than the folks that are making the chemical proving that it's safe. You know, you'd think that they would say, here's all our research, this chemical is proven safe, we would like to market it. But instead, the regulators are usually the ones that are forced to provide the burden of proof. And so this comic kind of describes that precautionary principle. So basically, they have said that if you put like a frog or a lobster or something like that in a pot and you slowly, slowly, slowly turn up the heat to boiling, it changes so slowly that the frog never hops out. It just gets boiled because they don't know. You know, they don't notice it because it's so small. So this is basically the frogs are in the boiling water and they're like, prove we're gonna get boiled, and the other one's like, prove we won't. You know, so it's kind of interesting. So then we can talk about environmental hazards. Anything that can cause injury, disease, or death is known as a hazard. Okay, it can cause damage to personal or public property, and it can cause deterioration or destruction of environmental components. This is our working definition of a hazard. And then we can talk about life expectancy, and all of this is gonna, you know, these are like kind of like important background information that we need in order to understand the information in the unit. So in 1955, the average life expectancy was 48 years. Right now, it's 68 years, and then they expect it will be 73 years in 2025. Now, here's something interesting. Um, if you look, the United States is right here, right? We're not anywhere close to the top of the highest life expectancy. And in fact, we're like in the bottom to mid third, right? Who has the highest life expectancy? It looks like Canada, right? And then after that is Japan and Australia. And then it kind of goes down from there. Colombia has the lowest life expectancy, then Paraguay, and then the Czech Republic. Okay, so we are like right in between Germany, and the UK. Okay, so it's interesting that we don't have that highest life expectancy because we kind of think that we're like this, great best country, but we're it's, in, in terms of life expectancy, we're not. So a sixth of the deaths in the world are kids under the age of 5 in developing countries. And almost half of this is caused by infectious disease. They're just dying because they get sick, which is sad. Um, and so you can look. So a quarter of the deaths worldwide, all deaths, adults and kids, are due to infectious and parasitic diseases, and pneumonia is the most deadly. My little one got his 2 month shots yesterday, and one of the things I noticed is that he got a shot for pneumonia, and I was like, that's interesting. Um, and so the problem is a lot of times infections lead to dehydration, whether this is because you're going to the bathroom a lot, whether because you're throwing up, whether because you don't feel well and you don't want to drink. And that can quickly become life-threatening, being dehydrated. With kids, they like to say it's really important to just like shove liquids down them, not actually shove, but try and give them as many liquids as possible. And they really worry about like how many diapers they're putting out and that sort of thing, feeling well, because dehydration can be so dangerous so quickly, especially with small people, because they're so small, they don't have that much liquid to begin with. And so you can see here from infectious diseases, respiratory infections. Acute respiratory infections kill over 4 million people a year. Then diarrheal diseases, which is over 2 million. Then AIDS is 2 million. Tuberculosis is 1.4, and malaria is 889,000. So malaria is the fifth highest, which is so then I think there's a question, an FRQ question about like malaria versus DDT. If you're in a country where malaria is really prevalent, maybe you might feel like it's worth it to have DDT on you rather than, get malaria. Columbia Clothing Company makes some clothes that are like supposed to be insect resistant insecticides, and they put this insecticide permethrin on the clothes, which actually has proven to be very dangerous to things like cats and stuff. They suggest you don't, leave those clothes out. But if you're going to somewhere where there's a high incidence of malaria, you might feel like it's worth it to wear those permethrin clothing um, rather than getting malaria, which is, very dangerous. It's one of the top fifth infectious disease deaths worldwide. So it just depends, and it's interesting. A lot of these things too are things that people get vaccinated for. So we get vaccinated for measles in the United States. We get vaccinated for pertussis, whooping cough. I actually had to get a whooping cough shot while I was pregnant to pass some of that immunity on to my son while he was in the womb. The pertussis shot actually has the tetanus in it as well. Um, and I think we get vaccinated against tuberculosis and maybe even meningitis, but I'm not certain. But I know definitely measles and pertussis and tetanus. So let's talk about, while we're doing risk assessment, the risk of being poor and the risk of being rich. So poverty overall, if you are poor, that is the world's biggest killer. And it's not necessarily like poor of what we would think in the United States, like, oh, we can't afford a new Xbox. It's just very, very poor, like people that live on less than $1 a day. Um, and when you're poor, you can't afford food, you can't afford health care, and so you really tend to struggle with a lot of these things. Um, if you can't afford food, you can become underweight, which often strikes kids that are less than 5, and that's actually the number one killer worldwide of being underweight. Um, and you can see most of the kids that die from being underweight are in from developing countries, right? This little tiny blue is developed countries. So we don't have a lot of kids dying from being underweight here, but the bulk of the world's population is in these developing countries anyway. Um, So, and you can see a lot of these things, right? From being poor, right? This is going to be a big killer if you're poor. This is from being poor usually. Um, this could be from being poor. You know, you can't afford a good place to live. Um, you might not be able to afford contraceptives or birth control or whatever. Um, so a lot of those are from being poor. Now we can talk about the risks of being rich. Um, so if you're rich, you can usually afford healthcare and things like that. So you tend to die of diseases of old age. Those tend to affect you more. Cancer is usually considered a disease of old age because if you remember from your biology class, the way cancer occurs is something is not right in the, there's a mutation or something's not going right in the reproduction of the DNA. And so it goes into overdrive and creates and so the more times your cells have reproduced, the more, the higher statistically your likelihood is that you'll get cancer, right? That you're something messed up on your cells. And so cancer is usually a disease of old age. Kids can get cancer because it's, statistically, it's a statistics game, but, um, you know, there's always that 1%, right? And then diseases of the circulatory system, like heart disease and things like that. Um, so those are the kinds of things that you tend to suffer from if you are rich. And rich doesn't necessarily mean like Donald Trump rich. It means like relatively rich. Like I would say that most of us in this class are probably in this category, even if we don't consider ourselves rich. So then we can talk about infectious disease, and sometimes they call this medical ecology, how diseases spread and things like that. A lot of times diseases spread when food or water was contaminated. And this is, again, it happens a lot in developing countries because they don't have really good sewage treatment. There are actually 2.5 billion on the planet, probably more than that now, that don't have adequate sanitation. Okay, and then almost 1 million people on the planet don't have access to safe drinking water, right? So these are ways, again, risks of being poor. If you are relatively rich, you're more likely to have adequate sanitation, drinking water, and that kind of thing. Oh. So, more diseases. So a vector is the thing that's, so we can talk about, we have vectors in physics, right, which are completely different. These are like biology vectors. These are the organism that like spreads the disease, whatever it is. So malaria is spread by mosquitoes, and so killing mosquitoes kills the vector. There are some diseases like cholera that are spread from drinking water. If you clean up the drinking water, which basically kills the critter that causes cholera, um, then you're killing the vector, right? You're controlling the vector. And then and that's going to get people, controlling the vector is better than treating the disease because with the vector you're going to get um, before the people get sick, right? You're preemptively trying to keep people from getting sick, right? Um, for example, putting on bug spray, right? Putting on bug spray is going to preemptively protect you from malaria, right? Because maybe the mosquitoes won't bite. Where a treatment strategy would be trying to cure people once they're infected. So instead of controlling the vector, let's say the mosquito, you get malaria, and then you're treated for your symptoms are treated. That would be a treatment strategy, basically trying to cure you once you've already gotten the illness. Um, Vaccines would be a type of vector control. So then we can talk about risk pathways. We can talk about chronic and acute, which are the two main, and then carcinogenic is kind of like a sub one of both. Chronic is when if you're exposed to something over a long period of time. So let's say you are a coal worker and you're continually exposed to coal dust, okay, over a long period of time, and then you get black lung or whatever. That is a chronic, you got that from being chronically exposed to something. Then let's say that like when Chernobyl exploded and the folks that went in there that were sent in there to clean up the Chernobyl or build a sarcophagus around it, they were suffered from acute exposure. They were exposed to a huge dose at once, not over a long period of time, but a huge dose over a short period of time. So that's considered acute, and then carcinogenic just means it causes cancer.